August 17, 1940, 98A Rathgar Road in Dublin, Ireland. It was Saturday night to the southern suburbs of the capital city, and 5 police officers slowly and quietly surrounded this address. These included Richard Hyland and Patrick McCown, both of whom had fought in the Irish Civil War on opposite sides of the conflict. 3 men walked up to the front door, and 2 circled around the back, responding to reports of an illegal IRA meeting. To their surprise, a man answered the door, and they rushed to subdue him. In the struggle, the 2 others present in the building began to fire on them as they advanced down the hallway. Their ringleader was a man named Patrick "Paddy" McGrath. Celebrated as a rebel since his youth, the 45-year-old Dublin native had served with the anti-treaty IRA in the Civil War. He was revered as a member of Easter Rising by the few men who continued to fight into World War II. Up to the day he was lined up against a wall and executed in Mountjoy Prison, he sported a bullet in his chest from 1916. In terms of rank, he was the IRA's adjutant general, but he had a senior role in that organization. Also in the flat was Thomas Hart, an alias, according to papers published on April 26th, detailing their speedy death sentences. The Dublin Evening Herald claimed his real name was Thomas Green, which should be taken seriously because they would have vetted him before his sentence was passed down. Hart was a captain in the IRA, a native of Lurgan, County Armagh, at the time and up to this day a part of the United Kingdom. Hart was only 25 years old at the time, and for him the fight was personal. His home remained outside of the Republic's new borders. Finally, you had Thomas Hunt, the youngest and least known volunteer for the shootout at 21 years old. All 3 men were early members of the post-Civil War IRA, which had officially disbanded years earlier. As the viewer knows, the IRA never stopped existing, and elements refused to accept the peace treaty that gave the crown the north of Ireland. 2 police were killed in this shootout, both in the special branch, Sergeant McCown and Detective Hyland. A second detective was wounded by the name of Brady. Hyland led the charge down the center of the building and was shot 7 times. Before dying on the floor, he fired and probably wounded one of the 3 IRA men. Hearing the gunfire, the 2 policemen waiting behind the building rushed through the back door, and the trio inside made a break for it, shooting McCown in the gut. He would also die on that same day. Detective Michael Brady's survival was a miracle. He was shot in the spine while standing at the door, but somehow managed to pull through. Some sources say that Paddy McGrath was armed with a Thompson submachine gun. The 2 officers chasing them fired several shots, some of which at least hit their mark. McGrath and Hart were both captured nearby, and when he was found, Hart had an obvious limp, while Hunt was trashed down several days later. The IRA narrative claimed that only 2 men were actually in the building at the time of the shooting, Thomas Hart and Tom Hunt. The police entered the building forcibly, firing as they breached the door. According to Paddy McGrath, when he was on trial, he heard the shots and rushed in after the officers scattered in pursuit of Thomas Hunt, leaving the building empty save for a wounded Hart. It's there that he was arrested. No inquest was ever held into the death of the 2 officers. Now I should again point out that McGrath was already a hero to Irish Republicans, and wasn't likely to falsely testify just to save his own skin. Consider the fact that he was one of the leaders of the 1939 Arbor Hill hunger strike. He was willing to starve himself, so why would he lie just to say he wasn't there when the shooting began? After all, he also didn't say that he didn't shoot, he just said he wasn't there when it started. They knew he was a very influential man in the IRA, and at least according to him, needed a reason to execute him. The trial which followed, and the details of what investigators found inside the house, is hard to believe. Hart was carried into the Collins Barracks on a stretcher next to Paddy McGrath only 4 days after the shooting. Both declared that they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the Irish state, and therefore the legitimacy of the military tribunal. They were quickly sentenced to death by firing squad, and denied their chance to speak to the court at the end of the trial. This sentence was carried out early Friday morning, September 6, 1940, the day before the trial of Tom Hunt, a mostly unknown Republican. The IRA at that time was incensed. Hunt was only being tried the day after so that McGrath and Hart couldn't testify on his behalf. He too was sentenced to the firing squad, but this was commuted to life in prison. According to the authorities, and mostly accepted by modern historians, Paddy McGrath had gotten the IRA wrapped up in the German war effort, not necessarily as supporters, but as opportunists. The idea was to hit a series of targets across Britain, mostly acts of industrial sabotage, which would force the British to make peace with losing Northern Ireland so that they could more closely focus their efforts on fighting the Germans. Once the North was turned over, the bombing campaign would stop, and the Crown knew this because they had issued demands. McGrath's role was essential as a senior Republican and as head of EOD training. From January 1939 to March of 1940, over 300 targets were struck across the UK as a part of Plan S, resulting in only 10 deaths. Eamon de Valera used his emergency powers to preserve Irish neutrality, making acts of sabotage punishable by execution. The last thing that Ireland wanted in the 30s and 40s was to get wrapped up in another war, so every effort was made to track down what remained of the IRA, which, albeit very rarely committed to the Germans ideologically, had seemingly been collaborating with them just to weaken the British. That said, authorities did nothing to stop a startling rumor. Papers detailing Plan Kathleen were recently discovered at a separate home raid detailing a proposed invasion of Northern Ireland. German occupation forces were to be assisted by the IRA on the ground. However, the IRA overstated their public support to the Germans, and the Germans led the IRA to believe they'd have a larger and more neutral role than they would have been given if they actually had gone through with that invasion plan. 9 months later, Stephen Hayes was secretly abducted from his hideout in Northern Ireland by members of the IRA. Hayes was their chief of staff, and he stood accused in front of their secret military tribunal of leaking information to the police in Dublin. If the accusations are correct, much of this seems to have been his personal attempt to thwart an IRA-German alliance, and he was even accused of leaking the location of the Rathgar Road building, which may or may not have been a training base for their bomb-making campaign, to the authorities in Dublin. Knowing that the IRA intended to kill him, he agreed to draft a confession and sign it, but was only doing so to buy himself more time. This was rumored to be 150 pages long and took him weeks to complete. While his watch slowly let their guard down, he slipped out the back and returned to Dublin, where he surrendered to the police. His time spent as chief of staff ruined what was left of the IRA, and the Irish government wasted no time in propagandizing it. The collaboration with the Germans, the bombings across England, the plans to invade, men left in droves, and what little popular support they still had almost totally dried up overnight. Now, the IRA's brush with fascism remains a deeply controversial topic to this day. Republicans will claim that the IRA only collaborated with Germans to weaken the British, while loyalists will argue that they always had a religiously conservative tilt. I would personally argue that they were in the vein of clerical fascism, closer to Francisco Franco or Mussolini than Hitler, and even then that was only a part of the IRA. Considering what the majority of Irish Republicans became, socialist urban guerrillas in the time of the Troubles, past martyrs like the man buried here, Michael Patrick Lynch, are left out of Irish historiography. Stories of men like Stephen Hayes and the Rathgar Road shootout are sometimes discussed, but in mostly slanted ways, leaving out the involvement of the Germans or only arguing that Hayes was guilty for turning over information, for example, but not mentioning the greater context behind it. But more to the point, Mike Hayes, who's buried in the quiet countryside of County Cork. A year after Easter Rising, Irish Republicans held a convention in Dublin. De Valera was elected president, Michael Collins director, and Cathal Brugha the chief of staff, making him leader of the military. In late 1919, Cathal Brugha proposed they have volunteers take an oath to the Irish Republic, a decision made without approval of the British, of course. This wasn't done for another year, but the volunteers began calling themselves the Irish Republican Army. When these men were captured, they would refuse to recognize or cooperate with the courts, a common theme going forward. Cathal Brugha wanted to solve the issue through politics, but the much more popular Michael Collins subverted his higher authority, which was only higher on paper, by ordering the IRA to carry out actions himself without approval from the chief of staff or anybody else in the IRA for that matter. De Valera and Cathal Brugha tried to rein in Michael Collins, demanding he order the IRA to undertake regular battles instead of fighting in insurgencies. But Collins said he was fighting to win the war, not for propaganda. At this point, most IRA men were highly educated urban partisans fighting in major towns, because farmers and fishermen were far more Catholic and conservative. As a result of the Anglo-Irish War, the Irish Free State was established in 1921, which led to a civil war when Dublin allowed the UK to hold on to the north of Ireland. Volunteers who refused to stop fighting the Crown were referred to as anti-treaty IRA and began to fight both the British and the new Free State. Dublin was worried that the UK would accuse the Free State of fighting them, so it was an early top priority to clamp down on anti-treaty forces, lest they lose their hard-fought-for sovereignty. Moss Toomey became the new chief of staff of the anti-treaty IRA and very cautiously admitted left-wingers. These leftists had played a minor role in early IRA actions during that War of Independence inspired by the Russian Revolution and by socialist revolts across Eastern Europe. They had even declared a number of Irish Soviet republics, notably in Limerick, a hotbed of left-wing activity. As you would expect of a newly independent state after a war, politics was very turbulent. In fact, the recognized Irish chief of police, O'Duffy, formed a corporatist paramilitary on the model of fascist squads spreading across the continent. They called themselves the Blue Shirts, and to bolster his popularity, O'Duffy led a unit of volunteers to fight for Franco in Spain, killing leftists, trade unionists, and anarchists or Republicans. O'Duffy's Irish volunteers, however, were mostly kept in the barracks and used for propaganda. They saw very little action during the Spanish War. Still, it sent a message to the leftist activists in Ireland that the new government was shifting far to the right, and many were motivated to join the IRA as face political dissidents. In 1925, IRA representatives met Joseph Stalin. They agreed to spy on the UK in exchange for £500 a month to finance their revolution, but this only lasted a few years. The IRA was taking baby steps towards the left, while the Irish government was swerving to the right. Chief of Staff Toomey believed the Soviets were only trying to exploit them and never trusted the USSR. The original IRA had no social plan, and to the outside just seemed to be anti-British government or anti-colonialism. But in the years leading up to World War II, quite a few local commands were seized by communists. Toomey continued to tolerate them, and by the 1930s, Ireland experienced the Great Depression. Radicalized by the rise in poverty, the IRA swelled to 10 times the previous post-war size. It began to shift as far left in places as O'Duffy shifted the Irish Republicans to the right. Soon the Blue Shirts aimed to counter the IRA, and the two groups often clashed. However, both the IRA and the Blue Shirts were opposed to the farm annuities leveled by British landowners and competed to demonstrate against them. These anti-annuity protests occasionally created riots and resulted in bloodshed. Michael Patrick Lynch, donning his blue shirt, became a corporatist and arguably a clerical fascist martyr when he drove through the gates of an auction house and was shot and killed during one of these protests against farm annuities. As Ireland and the IRA distanced themselves from O'Duffy, the martyr was almost totally forgotten, but to this day, his family holds on to his blue shirt as a relic of his sacrifice. The IRA continued as a mostly dormant group for a long time after the Civil War ended, occasionally springing up and carrying out an attack. They suffered blow after blow, each more demoralizing than the last. In the 1930s, it was obvious that Europe was on the brink of another war, and a number of British officers were openly recruiting young Irish men to fight in the army, giving them recommends and instructing them to head to Belfast to enlist. Tom Barry wasn't having any of this. Barry was famous for his role in the War of Independence and in organizing an ambush that killed 16 British soldiers in 1920. Now a leader in the post-war IRA, he ordered the execution of the recruiter, a brother of Vice Admiral Henry Boyle Somerville. Volunteers approached Somerville's home on Ireland's southern coast and knocked on his door. When he answered, he was asked, "Are you Somerville?" He responded, "Admiral Somerville." He was shot and the volunteers made their escape, but Tom Barry soon regretted that decision, the execution. The hope was to kill Admiral Somerville's brother, but not only did they miss, they backfired so badly it hurt their cause. See, Admiral Somerville was actually beloved by the Irish. In spite of being an Englishman, he greatly admired Irish culture so far as to learn the language and actively fundraised for Irish causes. He would give young men recommends for the British Army, but it was his brother that acted as a regular recruiter. Barry regretted killing him, both for moral reasons and because it marked the beginning of a much greater crackdown on IRA activities. By the start of the Spanish Civil War, Catholic conservatives were signing up with O'Duffy to go to Spain, promised they were fighting the enemies of the faith. Tom Barry tried to keep the IRA apolitical. Members would have opinions, but they had no political program and wanted to remain nothing more than a force to fight the British occupation in the north of Ireland. Because of this, Barry strictly forbade the IRA from fighting in Spain for either faction, although some slipped through. Barry's leadership was, in my opinion, the best for the IRA, but it didn't make him a popular man. At that time, another high-ranking Republican named Sean Russell had been demoted to quartermaster because he had ordered, at his own behalf, a bombing campaign without approval from the IRA's Army Council. This made him popular among the IRA's supporters, who saw him as another Michael Collins, a man who would act outside of the council and secure a great victory. Tom Barry and Sean Russell worked together on a plan to invade Northern Ireland during a period of strained relations. This plot sounds almost impossible, but with numbers bolstered by the recent Great Depression and political trouble, they actually had the manpower to do it, and even built rebel camps close to key infrastructure along the border. Information leaked days before the planned invasion, and eventually it was called off. When elections were held within the IRA, Sean Russell was voted chief of staff, basically the head of the organization, and Tom Barry was glad to take a step back for a while. But soon, Sean Russell began a strange and controversial relationship with the Nazis in Europe. Just before Britain formally entered World War II, Sean Barry made another decision outside of IRA approval, one that proved much less popular. He traveled to America and made contact with Joseph McGarity of Clan na Gael, a successor group to the Fenian Brotherhood that had been in America and Canada since the U.S. Civil War. The understanding was that Joseph McGarity had personally met with Hermann Göring to discuss what he claimed was Plan Kathleen, the future invasion of Northern Ireland. We'll discuss this more later in the video, but this seems to have been mostly a rumor, although he did meet with a German spy. He had been promised by a German spy that the IRA would act as a policing unit after this invasion and relayed this to Sean Russell, the leader of the IRA. Soon, Plan S was adopted with German intelligence cooperation. When he heard the news, Tom Barry fled the country. He didn't want to play a role in an IRA that collaborated with the Germans for any reason. To this day, Sean Russell is a complex and controversial figure in the IRA's history, while Tom Barry's name is mostly unsullied by anything other than losing the great popularity contest in the interwar period. Now, this is an unusual part of the video because I made another video a long time ago about Lord Haw Haw, a Nazi collaborator and fascist executed for high treason in 1946. Real name, William Joyce. He came from a complex and fascinating Irish background, but was actually born in Brooklyn, New York. His father was a devout Irish Catholic from a family of tenant farmers in County Mayo, to the far west of the island. William's father, Michael Joyce, obtained U.S. citizenship in 1894, and William himself, born on U.S. soil in April 1906, became a naturalized citizen. His mom, Gertrude Brooke, came from a family of well-to-do physicians and doctors who hailed from Connaught, although she was born in Lancashire, in England. At the risk of reading too deeply into his family's past, I should point out that in Irish historiography, Cromwell, while establishing the plantation of Ireland, doomed the Irish to hell or to Connaught, the far west of the island, west of the River Shannon. Sparsely populated, deeply Catholic, and steeped in Irish folklore, this region of Ireland is where you can still hear the native tongue spoken. Both sides of Lord Haw Haw's family hailed from Connaught, an outpost of Irish culture in the face of British imperialism. Still, both families wandered and drifted. His mother's people married into Anglo-Irish nobility, and his father's fled to the land of opportunity, to New York. The Protestant Brooke side of the family was also furious at Gertrude for marrying a poor Irish Catholic. William Joyce was the byproduct of that, something he was aware of from a very young age. From such a conflicted background comes a well of extremism and radicalization. Only a few years after his birth, he was brought back to Ireland, to Salt Hill in Connaught. Like most interesting periods of Irish history, what happens next is controversial, but it's believed that little William, a child, was recruited as a courier to the Anglo-Irish War. The man who brought him into the fold is said to have been Captain Patrick William Keating, an intelligence officer stationed in County Galway. He recognized that young William Joyce was a perfect courier. His parents were both radical Unionists. Half the family were Anglo-Irish Protestants, but William himself had been enrolled in a Catholic school and had plenty of friends in the Catholic community. The IRA at this time strongly suspected that the boy, only in his early to mid-teens, was an associate of the Black and Tans, mostly unemployed veterans of the Great War who found work in the Royal Irish Constabulary. To Republicans, the Black and Tans were ruthless, often wearing civilian clothes and employing terror and disappearing opponents of the crown. Perhaps the most pivotal event in his life up to this point, which we know with very little certainty, is his involvement in the murder of Father Michael Griffin, who's buried here. Griffin is exactly the kind of man who the Black and Tans would have assassinated. His father had been chairman of Galway's County Council, and he himself had been an associate and friend of Charles Stewart Parnell, leader of the Home Rule League. Father Michael was also a member of the National Land League, another Irish cultural organization. A prominent member of the Republican community, there was nothing the Black and Tans could legally arrest him for. The breaking point came after several funerals officiated by Father Michael Griffin. He would hold services for fallen IRA volunteers throughout the War of Independence, and he was warned to stop by men in the Black and Tans and by Unionists. A man of faith, he objected, saying every man, right or wrong, deserved a proper Christian burial. On November 14, 1920, he disappeared from his home in the night. The IRA suspected William Joyce was used to draw him right into the hands of the RIC auxiliaries, the Black and Tans. According to the IRA, 14-year-old William was sent to knock on his door and tell him that an old man was dying nearby, saying that he needed his last rites. Father Griffin quickly got dressed and left to the address, but was ambushed by Black and Tans and brought to Lennaboy Castle on Taylor's Hill. This had been used as a headquarters for the local auxiliary forces, a fact known to everyone in the county. There, according to local rumor, he was tortured and interrogated before being shot through the head. His body was found in a bog outside of town, and a day after the death of this man, the Bloody Sunday massacre would happen in Dublin, which would end up killing dozens. And Father Griffin, because of this, has sadly become more of a footnote more than a century later. At the time, though, he was a martyr for the cause. More than 12,000 mourners would attend his funeral. William Joyce was only 14 at the time, but he knew what he'd done, as did the IRA. While walking back from school, he was regularly accosted, and eventually an attempt was made on his life. But we know that Captain Keating tried to smuggle him out of the country. Young Joyce made his way to the Norton Barracks, where he intended to join the infantry. His real age was discovered several months later, and he was discharged, but he remained living in England, fearing an assassination attempt back in Ireland. 2 years later, his parents would join him there. While in England, he cultivated a stereotypical aristocratic accent, and eventually joined the British Union of Fascists as an ardent follower of Sir Oswald Mosley. He moved to Germany at the outset of the war, where he was given German citizenship and took a job as a Nazi propagandist and radio broadcaster. His voice became well known and often joked about, and is what earned him the title of Lord Haw Haw, an affected poshness that the fighting men found hilarious. He was executed at the start of 1946, and to his credit, supposedly displayed remarkable calmness. Joyce was never ashamed of his actions, and died confident that what he'd done was the right thing. For years, he was buried in the prison cemetery, but finally, in 1972, his bones were repatriated to County Galway at the request of his daughter. There, despite the fact that he was always ambivalent towards religion, he was given a Roman Catholic Catholic Mass. I feel that Father Michael Griffin would have been proud of his daughter for giving the man a proper burial. And this is the German military cemetery in Glen Cree, a fascinating place for the student of World War II history. The most famous grave here is that of Hermann Gortz, but many of these simple headstones carry tragic stories of men who found themselves imprisoned or lost in neutral Ireland throughout the war. The most visited site here by far, however, is the grave of Hermann Gortz, a famous German intelligence agent whose love of Ireland led him bumbling into the spycraft business at the hands of the Third Reich, which never really took his ideas all that seriously. Hermann's ties to upper Nazi leadership propelled his career in very strange ways. His career began in the Great War, where he showed a talent for interrogation. Because of this, he was sent to the Eastern Front and commissioned to the rank of captain. This is where he met Hermann Göring, a man who would later pull strings for him on his Irish ambitions. After the war, he joined the Freikorps, but decided that that wasn't a life he wanted, the life of a thug. He began traveling Europe, and by 1927 fell in love with Ireland. In fact, many influential men in the Freikorps had smuggled guns to Irish nationalists in their fight for independence, and many Irish and Germans felt a special love for each other's cultures after this trying period. Remember the story of the IRA's Chief of Staff Sean Barry, who traveled to America shortly after the war's outbreak, a journey without approval from IRA Army Council leadership. There he met Joseph McGarity of Clan na Gael, who led him to believe that he'd spoken with Hermann Göring and obtained German approval for Plan Kathleen, a planned invasion of Northern Ireland. In reality, it seems like Hermann Gortz was the man who met with McGarity, but the story of Göring wasn't that much of a stretch. Gortz and Göring, after all, were friends, and I'm sure that Gortz was doing his best to paint himself as a true messenger of Hermann Göring and of the Third Reich. Apparently, however, Gortz was acting alone and without any official commission from the Nazi government. He continued in his role as an amateur spy on his own behalf in 1936, before Britain officially went to war, by moving to East Anglia and befriending a British airman who handed him maps of airfields. Conspiracies exist about his true role in Nazi intelligence circles and the real need for these maps. There were even rumors that the Germans intended to invade along the coast of East Anglia, and in the event that this was actually carried out, they would have had to immediately target and capture these airfields. However, Hermann Gortz was caught, arrested, and eventually released, but not after several years in prison. The Brits realized he was acting on his own behalf, and although he was trying to spy for Germany, there was no commission, and there was no crime in resume building. When his 4 years in prison were over, he was deported right back to Germany and promptly interrogated by the Abwehr, German intelligence. Hermann's dreams of being a German spy had come true. German intelligence agents instructed him to make contact with Sean Russell's IRA, which had already requested help from Germany a year before Gortz was released from prison in 1938. Sean Russell had been instructed to carry out Plan S, bombing of industrial areas and sabotaging England's war effort. The Germans likely believed that Hermann Gortz would repair their image and planned to send him to alleviate political misgivings within the lower ranks of the IRA, many of whom were righteously pissed off that the Army Council was shifting towards clerical fascism. In 1940, Gortz was parachuted into the Irish countryside with instructions to hike to the home of O'Donovan, the man who helped Sean Russell formulate Plan S. Realizing that the presence of a German spy would hurt their image more than help it, he seems to have been cycled around to different safe houses until he could be spirited away to one in Dublin. Intelligence found its way to the government's desk, and they acted very quickly, refusing to give the Allies any reason to accuse them of Axis collaboration. The home was raided, and police supposedly found medals, swastikas, and maps detailing the invasion of Northern Ireland, as well as plans to use the IRA as an auxiliary police force in Belfast, working under Nazi leadership. Gortz was arrested, and as the war wound down to its end, began claiming he was in the SS. This seems to have been his own way of avoiding deportation back to Germany, which by now had been split into East and West. Hermann had no intention of being sent back to East Germany, which at the time was still under Soviet control. In 1947, when it was obvious that he was going to be deported from the country that he loved, he committed suicide. The tombstone at the back of the cemetery was his original headstone and has been left as a memorial to all the men buried here. Hermann was later given the same simple headstone as other soldiers who washed up on the shore of the Emerald Isle, befitting of all military men, uniformity, and burial right next to their comrades. Next, we have the graves of Helmut Klisman and Jan Goulet, who are laid to rest in the same cemetery in Shankill, Dublin, both some of the most controversial men tying Ireland to Germany in World War II. At a time when O'Duffy was sending his blue shirts to fight for fascism in Spain, many leftists were making their way to the country in order to fight against them. They fought for the freedom of Spain and to show the world that Ireland's working people and true Catholics were on the right side of history. One of these freedom fighters was named Frank Ryan, an intellectual with Republican values who soon found himself captured by Franco's fascist troops and wasting away in a prison. Frank Ryan's potential was quickly recognized by Helmut Klisman, who was a friend from his time as an exchange student living in Ireland. Before the war in Spain, Helmut Klisman had been in a cultural exchange program between the Irish Free State and German university students, where he made a number of contacts, including with young Frank Ryan, and had formed a circle of socialist and Republican progressive friends. Helmut Klisman had been a member of a leftist student organization when Hitler rose to power and knew Frank well from his time in Ireland, a country where he had deep roots, having actually married a beautiful Irish woman who came from a prominent Republican family, Elizabeth Budge Mulcahy. By the end of the Spanish Civil War, Klisman was in the Abwehr, the German intelligence. He learned his old college friend was in prison and proposed to the Germans a deal with Spain to secure his release. Frank Ryan had, in the meantime, been in ill health, even suffering a stroke behind bars. Thanks to Helmut Klisman, Frank Ryan was released, but this may be because Helmut convinced them that Frank was sort of their guy, a rebellious soldier of fortune who could be trusted on secret missions. Frank was no small fry, but his life in Berlin from his release to January 1943 may well prove his true feelings towards the Nazis. He lived in a large, dreary apartment in Berlin with Klisman as his old friend, cycling the streets of the capital, but often feigned deafness, according to his friends, to avoid conversations about politics with local Germans. He found himself in the odd position of a socialist progressive fighting against the rise of fascism in Spain, sprung from prison by his friend, only to have to go along to get along with the Nazis in a role he probably deeply regretted. We'll never know for sure, however, because his ailing health caught up with him and he passed away in 1944. Klisman, Frank's roommate in Berlin, helped formulate Operations Sea Lion and Lion, both of which aimed to land German soldiers on England's soil. Klisman's allegiances seemed to align broadly with the IRAs at that time, more so than with the Nazis. He wanted to weaken England so that Ireland could be united, and he didn't seem to be a committed Nazi. Helmut Klisman, who had been pulling strings and currying favor with the intellectual circles of the Abwehr, convinced the Germans to send him on a mission with his buddy Frank. He was to board a seaplane which would drop him off the Irish coast under the cover of darkness. There, Frank Ryan would meet in secret with Eamon de Valera and convince him to stop arresting IRA volunteers while they carried out their Plan S sabotage missions against England. Klisman told the Abwehr that Ryan could easily make de Valera see that Ireland could be united once England had been weakened through Plan S, that the crown was already stretched thin, and that it wouldn't even require Irish official support, just for them to look the other way and let them carry on with their plans. Meanwhile, Helmut Klisman would take a briefcase full of money to the IRA, enough cash to get them started on a campaign of sabotage in Northern Ireland. While this may sound like a plot straight out of James Bond, I think it much more likely, because of Klisman's progressive university background and Ryan's time spent in Spain, that they were going to snub the Germans the second they touched down on Irish soil, walking off into the sunset to Klisman's Irish wife with a briefcase full of money. However, when Hermann Gortz was arrested, the finer details of this plot were discovered, and the Germans shelved any plans they may have had. Frank Ryan passed away of supposedly natural causes just before the war's end, and Klisman was interrogated for a long while before being allowed to move to Ireland and back to his wife. He had a happier end, gaining Irish citizenship and starting a successful business, eventually founding the Irish section of Amnesty International. And finally, I may have saved the most interesting man for last, Jan Goulet. He wasn't an Irishman, but idolized the Irish cause from Brittany, one of the 6 Celtic nations: Ireland, Cornwall, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, and Brittany. He was born in 1914 in St. Nazaire, and prior to the Second World War was a member in good standing with the Breton National Party. Their platform was broadly pan-Celtic, but also fit in line with many of the other far-right movements of the time, incorporating elements of fascism and collaborationism. They were also anti-Semitic for the same reason as the Germans, believing that the Jews were a sort of cultural vacuum, destroying any kind of cultural nationalism wherever they went. The paramilitary wing of the party, the SBB, was Bagadou Storm, whose importance will become important later. Like many non-German Nazi collaborators, Jan had complex reasons for joining. Yes, he was a member of a fascist Breton cultural club, but he was also a member of the SFIO, the French section of Workers' International, a leftist political organization closed by the Germans after their conquest of France. Many members of this SFIO were proud members of the French anti-fascist resistance. Not Jan. Jan was an artist studying at the Beaux Arts de Paris. He was a student of Charles Despots, an assistant of Auguste Rodin, a member of Seize Breur, an artistic movement founded in Brittany in the interwar period in the early 1920s. This artistic movement, Seven Brothers, referred to a medieval folktale about Brittany. Before the war, most of the 50-odd members of Seize Breur espoused neither red nor white, but Breton, all of whom saw the arts as a way of promoting Breton nationalism. However, their politically neutral stance was shattered when an architect and member member of their group, Olier Mordrel, broke away with Jan Goulet and other members to the Breton National Party. All of the members listed worked in some way or another with occupation authorities, believing that a Nordic Europe would be receptive to pan-Celtic nationalism and to their sort of esotericism built around Druidic mythology, and Seyss-Breuer suffered after the war because of this association. Their core beliefs were mainly rooted in neo-Druidism and an idealism for rural, maritime life, as well as to stories related to King Arthur, which resonated with upper Nazi leadership. In 1938, right before Christmas, the monument to the Breton and Angevin Federation in Pontivy was destroyed in an act of sabotage by a Breton nationalist group, an act which Jan Goulet was arrested and released for because of lack of evidence. Right after his release, he was sent to Strasbourg to be instructed in sabotage on behalf of the French army. They knew that the Germans planned to invade and needed men to blow the bridges and create trouble behind enemy lines. While still a Breton nationalist, he was a fence-sitter and wasn't prepared at the outset to exchange one occupier for another. He fought for France and was arrested by the Germans in June of 1940, caught red-handed trying to blow a bridge with a group of his personal friends. When they discovered his Breton nationalism, they realized he would be a collaborator, and he worked throughout the war in the paramilitary of the Breton National Party as a leader of the collaborationists Brigade Storm. He was promoted to the head of this section in 1941 in Paris and named the officers here Patrick Purse Group in honor of the poet and writer executed for his role in Easter Rising for the 25th anniversary. To many Celtic nationalists, he came to embody the ideas of the Revolution of 1916. After the war, Jan Goulet naturally fled France to avoid reprisals. In his absence, he was sentenced to death and knew that he'd be extradited if he ever set foot on the UK's soil. Still, as a supporter of Irish republicanism, he took part in a greater artistic revival of Celtic culture, designing the memorial to the East Mayo Brigade, the Ballyseedy Memorial, and the monument to the Custom House in Dublin. His most famous or infamous memorial, however, is often called the Nazi Monument in Crossmaglen. I myself heard stories about this monument from Belfast. Goulet knew that if he were caught installing this memorial on the UK's soil in Northern Ireland, he'd be deported to France. They may not have executed him after all these years, but he would have spent years behind bars at the very least. In 1979, in the middle of the Troubles, and with a British military presence right in the town of Crossmaglen, he hastily brought this statue to the town square and had it installed. I've heard from locals in Belfast that this was done in the middle of the night, but that seems to be more of an urban legend. His life was fairly low profile outside of political circles in Ireland, and in 1952 he gained Irish citizenship. This enabled him to become a professor in Dublin, and his works were regularly shown at the Royal Hibernian Academy. Towards the end of the 1960s, he began claiming to have ordered all of the attacks of the successor group to the one which destroyed the monument in 1938. This group was now calling itself the Liberation Front of Brittany. This group was now Marxist-Leninist in character, allied with the Free Wales Army, the IRA, and the Basque ETA. Skeptics, however, believed that he was only taking credit for the attacks, but he may well have been financing them through a network of artists, academics, and architects in France. He died 2 days after his 85th birthday in 1999 and was buried here in Dublin.